Hi, welcome to this week's Message and Music. I'm Reverend Jenny Williams. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm one of the co chairs of Justice and Jubilee. The message that you're going to hear today is something that I recorded a couple of years ago in summer 2021, about 3 weeks into the start of a 3-month sabbatical that I had from the daily and weekly responsibilities of being a pastor. The message is about something that I experienced that morning, and I sort of just had to get it out and record it. And it's never anything that's been published. I recorded it just off the cuff, sitting on the back steps of the parsonage that I lived in at the time. Maybe it's for someone who's hearing it today. It ends sort of abruptly. I cut off the camera really quickly, but I hope that you'll stick around and listen to the piece of music that follows and that it provides joy for you and a time of reflection. Afterwards, we'll gather together on Zoom. If you're watching this synchronously, we'll drop the link in the chat and hope that you can join us for our spring fling, just a time to meet other people who are identify in some way with Christ or the church and seek justice in this world, and particularly in the state in which we live. Next week, I hope you'll join us. That's Sunday, May 28th. We're not watching synchronously at that time, but it's our Pentecost worship service with Reverend Alba Onofrio, who's preaching, and Kasha McDonald of West Virginia Black Pride Foundation will be providing the music. We'll also watch that synchronously at some point the following week, but wanted to point that out to you and make sure that you didn't miss it. We've loved being with you during this time of message and music, and hope that you'll also be watching our emails for what's to come this summer. We've got some neat and different stuff coming up. Bless you. Well, hey there. Haven't done one of these in a while. It's my first Sunday home during a sabbatical. I had been gone the first 2 Sundays, so this is just my 3rd Sunday off. And I guess once a preacher, always a preacher. So I actually was thinking about some things today and just figured that I would share them with folks. So today was the first day that I was going to go worship at a church. The last 2 Sundays being out of town in Hawaii. That was not, I didn't even know what day it was. But it felt a little bit weird to be here and not to be worshiping. And so went to worship this morning. And something pretty crazy happened with the scripture that was read. So I wanted to share that with you. Before I went to worship, I was praying a little bit. I don't even really know what that means these days, but I was sitting and reflecting, and a scripture popped into my mind. And it was a scripture of a woman who had been bleeding for 12 years, and Jesus healed her. And I was thinking about that scripture. And I had 2 things that I wanted to say about that particular passage. The first was when I went to worship this morning, which was at the church where my husband belongs, went to worship there, and we were going through the service, and it was lovely. And then the gospel was read. And guess what gospel lesson it was? It was the story of Jesus healing the woman who had been bleeding for 12 years. So that's the lectionary text, this calendar of texts that is written out so that pastors aren't preaching the same thing every time, and certain churches follow the lectionary. And so it's this calendar, it's like a 3-year calendar that takes you through most of the Bible. And I haven't paid attention to the lectionary since before the pandemic. Usually I'm a lectionary preacher, so I look at the texts ahead of time. You know, they're in this planner, and you can kind of look ahead at the following Sundays. And so I haven't looked at the lectionary in ages. So why that particular scripture popped into my head this morning before I went to worship is kind of amazing to me. I think the why, and then finding it out in worship that was the gospel lesson that was being read, is a God thing. So when it was being read in worship, I kind of started breathing fast, like, oh my gosh. And I had been reflecting on it this morning with a particular set of reflections. And so I took the fact that it was being read in worship, that I was hearing it there, as just a sign maybe, or a prompting to go ahead and record my reflections. So I'm going to read you a little bit of the scripture, the part that I was thinking about. It comes from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 5. And what precedes the part I was thinking about is Jesus comes into a town, comes back to the town where a lot of Jewish folks live. And And he gets out, and there's just this huge crowd around him, which always happens with Jesus. And a man comes to him. He's the leader of the local synagogue. So this man is important. He has a lot of power. He is probably on the wealthy side, and he is well esteemed, thought of among the religious people as a real community leader. And so he comes to Jesus and he's like, "Hey, Jesus, I don't know where you're going, but my daughter, my little girl, is deathly ill. Will you come be with her? And will you come lay your hands on her?" So that's what precedes this story that I'm about to read. And a large crowd followed Jesus and pressed in on him. And now there was a woman who'd been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She'd endured much under many physicians, and she'd spent all that she had, and she wasn't any better, but instead grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, for she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." And immediately her hemorrhage stopped. She felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And the disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." I was thinking about that story, about that woman who had suffered so much in her body for such a long period of time, 12 years, and how she was healed of that. And that often is the point of that story. The pastor made it clear today that one of the points of the story is this important man came to Jesus and said, "Will you come lay your hands on my child?" And Jesus responded to this man of great faith who believed in Jesus, who was well esteemed in the community. But on his way, he was willing to respond to this woman who was the polar opposite in the eyes of the religious people. She was a person that was unclean to touch. She was bottom of the barrel. She was ostracized. He shouldn't be touching a woman. He shouldn't be touching a woman who was bleeding. She was ill, so she was contaminating people around her. And Jesus has this exchange with her where she's a real person. And I thought about, Jesus often says this to people, "Your faith has made you well." And I thought about this woman who could have been stripped of her agency in the position in which she found herself, had found herself for 12 years. She could have shrunk into the background, just blended away, kept herself apart. And she thought enough of herself that she reached out and touched Jesus's cloak, believing that she would be healed. And Jesus thought enough of her, and enough of her thinking of herself, her valuing herself, that Jesus says, "Yeah, go your way, be healed." And I thought that what Jesus was saying in that moment was that bleeding women's lives matter. That this woman who believed she was worth something, who believed that she was worth the love of God, that she was worth something even in the face of a society that was shitting on her. Sorry, that's my air conditioning and I don't edit, so I'm just going to keep going. A society that was shitting on her, and she believed she was worthy enough to reach out and receive healing. Bleeding women's lives matter. Jesus goes on to then, after that, he does process on, and he goes to the synagogue leader's house, and he heals the little girl. He actually raises her. They think she has passed away, and this isn't a scientific treatise, so we don't know what was going on, but he raised her from that. And in that, this girl who was nothing in society, in paying attention to her, he was saying little girls' lives matter. The disciples are like, when Jesus says, who touched me? The disciples are like, look at all these people. You'll never figure out who touched you. They're all the same. They're all blending in together. And Jesus says, this one person is really hurt. Her life matters. It matters enough to me that I'm going to stop on my way to this important person's house and have an exchange with her and affirm what she affirms about herself. Her life matters. It was really interesting to me when I was in worship this morning. So there are 4 texts that are picked on the lectionary calendar. One of them is a text from the Hebrew Scriptures, or what we call the Old Testament. And the one that was read today is from 2 Samuel, verse 1. And this comes following verse 17. But it's a lament for Saul and Jonathan, and David is offering this lament, okay? And David in his lament says this for Jonathan, in Jonathan's memory. Jonathan lies slain upon your high places. I'm distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Greatly beloved were you to me. Your love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. Like, this one text in the lectionary is this specific place where David, high and powerful, identifies as male. David, in his lament and his eulogy for what everyone wants to call his friend Jonathan, David says that his friend Jonathan, his love for David surpassed all women. When queer commentators look at this passage, they're like, yeah, David and Jonathan, totally gay, right? Completely. Here he is eulogizing him and saying, your love surpassed all women. This very specific, explicit passage is in the lectionary the same week that this gospel lesson of this bleeding woman and this little girl are. This bleeding woman who is ostracized by purity laws, who decide who and isn't worthy. And Jesus says, those who are looked on as impure and unclean, their lives matter. So to have this text about Jonathan and David, we know that queer lives matter. The purity laws, which would have said inappropriate for a bunch of reasons that get screwed up in interpretation by conservative Christians. Bleeding women's lives matter, little girls' lives matter, gay lives, queer lives matter to God. You matter. The lives of the people that are marginalized by systems of power and oppression, by racism, by homophobia, your lives matter to God. Your belief in yourself, God honors. Your love, knowing that you were created fearfully and wonderfully, that this is how you were made, your life matters. God honors your understanding of yourself as good and loving. I just wanted you to hear that message today. I wanted you to know, because it welled up in me and I can't not, I guess, as a preacher on sabbatical. I wanted you to know how very much that you are loved. And the word that we use in the church a lot is worthy. But you're worthy. And you matter.